quarantine is really hard because of that, right?
I mean, people are like willing to die to be in a crowd.
Yeah.
They're willing to sacrifice their own life to be with other people. I would rather be, you know, we've just had the football in London, and, you know, I'm sure tons of people were vaccinated, but there's pretty lots of people who weren't, who were willing to sacrifice their health and maybe the health of other people for that joy of being in a crowd, that collective, you know, just joy of being with other people and cheering on their team. It's about the connection that we need. And, you know, all of the institutions, you know, that's churches, religion aside, is around giving people sort of a sense of purpose and rituals, and but it's around that collective, you know, purpose together. And that's what people crave when they haven't got it. And we can see that. I mean, people are willing to set aside their own health to be with other people.
So welcome to the show, Dr. Sarah. Should I call you Dr. Sarah, Dr. Mckay?
No, just Sarah. Just Sarah.
Sarah? No, doctor?
Please, yes. No, don't go for any of that. As long as it's doctor, not Ms. or Mrs. or Miss. But I prefer Sarah.
Okay, Sarah. Okay, when I came across your work, just the thought of a female neuroscientist, you know, I can't even tell you just what it means.
That's very cool. Well, look, I should just say, I mean, it might sound like we're a rare creature, but within neuroscience, and certainly up until when you get into the very, very senior professorship years, there's a lot of gender parity, and I've worked in neuroscience, you know, been a student and worked in neuroscience departments in about 5 different universities in 4 different countries, and there's always been, because often it's paired with psychology, there's always as many women as men. And even when I was in Oxford, there were 5 of us that got our scholarship my year, and 3 were women and 2 were men. So, you know, I don't think that women and within neuroscience, you hear a lot about women in STEM, but there's many different subjects within the STEM field, and psychology there'd be more women, and neuroscience has always been 50-50, and certainly even back in the 90s when I was an undergrad, it was that case. So we're not rare unicorns.
It feels like that, I have to say. It really does feel like in
the neuroscience community. And well, I mean, it's always the case in any industry. When you get through to the senior leadership, there will always be more men. But, you know, in terms of the lecturers I've had and the lab heads I've worked with, and the researchers and PhD students I've been with, my experience was always, and that was in 4 different countries, Australia, New Zealand, the UK and the US, and in about 5 different universities. My personal experience was there was always gender parity, and there were plenty of female neuroscientists. I think what you find is that the blokes are the ones that put their hands up and sort of shout more loudly.
So you're saying that there's
just to throw that out there. I think when we talk about STEM, that includes maths and engineering all the way through to sociology and psychology. And so there's actually a sort of I'm trying to think of the right word, within the different STEM subjects. Neuroscience sits quite in the middle in terms of that male-female balance. It's an interesting place. And it never actually occurred to me, this sounds weird, that I was a female until about 5 years ago. And even now I really don't think much about it. I wrote a book on the female brain, but up until that point, when someone suggested I write it, I hadn't really kind of considered being a female within neuroscience was a big deal, because there was plenty of us.
I feel kind of the same way. I think I don't really think about my gender identity, and I realize now, I think because I grew up in the 90s, you know, Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister.
The world peaked in the 90s. The 90s were the best.
Right? And it just felt like there was nothing to prove. History had ended. We were going to be on a never-ending progressive path.
Yeah, the world, I honestly think the world peaked in the 90s. I peaked in the 90s. Like, everything was great in the 90s. I'm all wrong. I'm
I'm
so glad that was like the prime of my life.
Yes,
Because like,
it was the
they were
best.
good years. And then it's just gone downhill.
Yeah.
And my life hasn't gone downhill, but I keep getting told it has. I mean, of course it has in the last couple of years, because of COVID, but like the 90s were good years to be a young
Yes,
woman.
I agree. I was saying I interviewed a young businessman on ethical capitalism, and I was saying to him, I think my naive optimism comes from the fact that I grew up in the 90s when the worst thing that could happen to you is what we were singing about in R&B songs, and Boys to
Yeah.
Men, and that was
Yeah, or maybe you wore double denim or something. And like I traveled the world with my friends when I left university because that was a real thing to do from, New Zealand, the New Zealand, Australia part of the world. And we traveled through Europe for months on end, and I'd ring my mum every few weeks on a payphone on reverse charges.
oh,
And there was nothing to be scared of or concerned about. And
yeah,
went to the UK and worked in a pub, and life was great.
yeah.
It was
Uh,
it didn't feel like there were any barriers to living your best life at
yes,
all.
yes.
At
And I
all. I
think that's
personally
what
didn't feel that
maybe,
way.
don't you think that's maybe what our generation can offer the world is reminding people the importance of having young people have that, you know, that way of seeing the world, because it really equips you, I think, for the hard times to come when you have a childhood that's, coated in comfort and security and optimism.
Yeah, and I was certainly encouraged to go out and see the world and be adventurous and to trust myself. And I never ever. And I went to girls' school with and nuns as our teachers, but they were like real social justice feminists. And I was really brought up with this mindset, that I could go and be and do anything. And my parents left school when they were both 15, so I was like a first generation high school graduate. But I never felt that meant that I couldn't end up in Oxford. Never, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, do whatever I wanted. And I have a lot of, and I think that there's a lot of movements these days. I'm starting to sound like a really old lady now. That is so amazing and promoting and helping and lifting up so many people, that perhaps were ignored back in our time. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I would love young people to still have that sense that I had. I'm not sure whether the world's changed, and certainly in the last year and a half it has. But like, God, when I was young, like the world was my oyster, and I honestly felt like that. And I
Yeah.
never felt there were any barriers for me to do or be whoever I wanted, and I just went out there and did it. And it's interesting, and I you carry a lot of your stories through, and that colours the lens with which you see the world. And I also think when I view STEM and women in STEM, I'm viewing that through my lens of going through the neurosciences, which, as I say, there was gender parity, and I never felt that it was a stumbling block or a difficulty to be a woman in science.
Yeah. No, it's really
I
interesting.
want young people to feel that way still, and it
Yeah.
makes me sad when they don't.
Yeah. I wonder sometimes, we were talking earlier about, the two worlds that you find yourself in. I'm constantly, as someone who works in media, I'm constantly trying to figure out if the frame that we are seeing the world through is just a constructed one completely.
Yeah,
That's,
I'm sure it is. Well, we grew up without that.
yeah.
We didn't
But
have
is
that. We
it
didn't have.
constructed by the media? All the new things that we now see. So, for example, even this whole gender parity issue in every single field. I mean, STEM is one that's constantly in the media. And so, if you're
Yeah,
saying that you didn't ever get the sense that there was an issue with gender parity,
yeah. I
maybe,
mean, I'm just talking about pure numbers here. Like
yeah,
pure numbers, there was not an issue.
Yeah.
And I'm coming as someone who's a first generation high school graduate. I didn't go to university feeling like I didn't deserve to be there. I didn't arrive at Oxford feeling like I didn't deserve to be there. I had
Yeah.
no sense of ever picking that. Where would I have picked that message up from? I mean, back then you had to read a newspaper by paper.
Yeah.
And if you didn't read it, then where on earth would you get that messaging from?
Yeah.
It's almost as if this maelstrom has like kind of started surrounding people and getting in under people's skin. And that's not to say that issues don't exist for people and there isn't discrimination and there aren't issues with gender equality and racism and everything out there that exists.
Yeah.
But I never experienced it personally, and that's partly growing up with, who I was, but also back then we had the only way you could pick that information up was through the media.
Yeah.
And my other mates weren't giving it to me because we were all just kind of bumbling along in the 90s doing our very best and thinking, well, isn't this a wonderful life?
Yeah.
And now I worry that there's just this constant barrage of, and I kind of feel a lot of the time that I'm being barraged with messaging around being a woman in STEM is this really hard, terrible, difficult place to be. And I feel like I don't feel like it is. I don't want to be told that it's more difficult for me than it is. I'm actually quite happy. And I really feel like I'm deflecting those messages.
Yeah.
Those messages may matter to other people, but I'm trying to unpack that a lot myself.
Mm-hmm.
About my experience when I was in my 20s versus other people's experiences in their 20s, and how much of it is, like you say, constructed.
Yeah.
And how much of it is real, and what do you tune into and out of. And if you've never known there's a signal there to read, that doesn't mean the signal wasn't there. It just means that you didn't pay attention to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I try to unpack the same things, whether that's race or gender or all of that through the media now, because I'm in the media. Well, the thing I'm most grateful for is that I wasn't consuming so much media at other times when, big events were happening, like during 9/11. I'm glad that I had a full-time job where I was working 14, 16 hours and I couldn't consume as much.
Well, the only way to find out about it was to watch that on the TV. I was in London on 9/11.
Yeah.
And I remember kind of racing home through the streets in the bus because I was going to stay with my boyfriend that night. I'd been in Oxford and rushing back to his house and turning on the TV because that was the only, the way you could get information. And then I remember when Princess Diana died, I was backpacking in Greece and we heard about it from someone. And then the next day there were some papers, but they were obviously not in English.
Yeah.
And then we just pieced together these little bits of the stories over kind of weeks.
See, we consumed it a lot. I was living in Kenya, and when Princess Diana died, it was on the news the whole time. And so I consumed so much of it. There were papers, and it was such a big event. So it's interesting because it's like if media is your frame, your experiences, your memories, your emotions are colored exactly how the media wants you to.
Absolutely. And that's why and you can protect yourself. You don't have to buy into it all. I often change my Twitter password and delete it all from my computer so I can't log in and see anything and engage in the kind of the toxic negativity of the Twitter narrative. Especially, we've just gone back into lockdown here in Sydney, and I really need to, and it's been really it's blindsided us in Sydney because we've lived the last year and a half pretty fine. We've had a few moments, but it's not looking great for the next month or so, and it's kind of blindsided us. I was at Hamilton, the musical, a few weeks ago, and was being back to fly to New Zealand to see my mum, and I just need to ignore all of the messaging and just kind of go back to the 90s style. I just need to focus on what's in front of me and keep my boys kind of on an even keel mentally and socially. But I mean, it's early days. It might not drag on. It just feels a bit doomsday right now, only because we were all going along and doing everything right, and everything was open and happy and free, and I was vaccinated, and suddenly we're thrust into lockdown, and it's happened so suddenly. And it's not that we're all in it together vibe that there was last year. There's a lot of anger and sadness.
Yeah. It was the same in January for us. January, February was the worst time to be in lockdown because, mentally we prepared for the kids to go back to school, and then you are back to homeschooling. It really plays havoc on your mind, especially if you're now constantly consuming, the number of deaths going up,
Yeah, I think you have to make a real effort to engage only with what you need to engage with.
Yeah.
Or else you can spend hours just wallowing around in the commentary, and
yes,
it doesn't help. It doesn't move you forward. It just creates a real negative emotional state because that's the data coming in.
Yeah.
And it feeds the uncertainty and feeds the anxiety and the stress and the panic, and there's no good emotions come out of it because you can't do anything about it.
You say that the brain is actually plastic, and that it's constantly adapting. It's not how we thought, that by the time you're 7, there's a fixed brain, and then that fixed brain, now you're just going to be in repetition mode. But you actually think that our brains change throughout our lives?
Well, they change a whole lot when we're very young.
Okay.
When we're going through infancy and childhood and our adolescence, our brains are constantly changing all different sort of functional areas and sort of behavioural attributes of our brain are deeply plastic through those early kind of first couple of decades of life, and the experiences that the brain has shape and sculpt it. But then there is a point in time when it becomes less adaptive and less changeable, less plastic, because then it kind of needs to get down to the job of processing the world in which you live and not constantly being modified to live in that world. So there is a bit of, there is kind of I don't want to use the word degradation, but kind of lesser plasticity as you get older. But it doesn't disappear entirely. It doesn't flatline. There are so many aspects. I mean, if the brain didn't change, we wouldn't be able to remember what we did the day before. You couldn't read a book because you couldn't remember the previous page and the previous chapter you read last night. Yeah. So the only way you can remember that is for the brain to, in some way, modify itself to store that memory. So the brain has to, by virtue of the fact that we form new memories, be plastic and adaptable to experience. But it doesn't change significantly and passively. It changes in a far more active way, whereby as an adult you need the right kind of conditions, and that's why when you're very young you can learn, if you grow up in a bilingual or multilingual environment, you grow up speaking 2 or 3 or more languages with ease. Whereas once you're kind of beyond your teenage years, you actually actively have to learn that language. You don't just learn it by default passively. You actively have to engage, and it's much more of a struggle to learn.
So up to what age would you say it's the most?
Well, there's not really. It's you couldn't really kind of put a date or an age on it.
Okay.
But typically we in terms of the biggest structural changes we see are kind of over and done with by kind of your early 20s, mid-20s. There's quite significant change taking place during adolescence. And that's particularly those parts of the brain which are involved in social cognition, so thinking about what other people are thinking and feeling. And we need that social engagement at that point in time to help shape those brain regions. So in the same way that a toddler or an infant needs to hear language, needs spoken language to wire up the language parts of the brain. When you're going through your adolescence, you need the social interactions to wire up the social brain. So, the brain kind of goes out and seeks the experiences that it needs. That's why young, teenagers, it's so important for them to kind of have as many social experiences as possible, because their brains require that in order to wire up. And then once you kind of get through to your early mid-20s, you're kind of almost at your cognitive peak. But then the brain needs to kind of, in a way, get on then with the process of getting your body through to the end of life. It doesn't need to be constantly modifying itself to the environment. It's got to the point where it kind of knows how the world works. Let's get on with living in it now. But certainly as we go through then the rest of our adult lives, the brain's receiving this constant stream of data from our bodies, from the world around us, and it's filtering that through, our lived experience to create any sort of moment in time, to, with any thought or emotion or behaviour is kind of created in the brain based on all these data streams that are constantly coming in. Now, in adulthood, you don't want all those data streams to be changed in the brain. You want the brain to be processing them and then determining how you behave next.
Yeah. But so then, in terms of what we were talking about in the last year, how do you think the stress, the uncertainty, the anxiety, how would that shape and rewire our brain?
Yeah. Oh, look, essentially the reason we have all felt stressed and anxious is because our brain likes to know what's happening next.
Yeah.
And that word uncertainty doesn't fit well in terms of what our brain does, because what our brain's doing is essentially reading all this data from the body, from the outside world, and our lived experience, and deciding how to behave next. When I was last in this physiological state, in this certain environment, what did I do? How did I behave? Now, go back to March last year when suddenly the world seemed to evaporate. Everything that we knew was going to happen next, wasn't going to happen. Everything, like every goal, every plan, every event just evaporated. For many of us, that certainty about what's happening next has come and gone, and Sydney's kind of plunged back into a state of uncertainty right now. This is, as we're recording this, mid-July 2021. And what our brain does is it relies on that input to decide what to do next. And when the input is unreliable, or the messages are mixed, or they don't fit in with what we expect, then the brain doesn't really know what to tell the body what to do. And that's very stressful, because typically, below the level of your awareness, a lot of the behaviours you have and emotions you feel and thoughts that you have are sort of determined based on all this reliable data coming in. When the data is unreliable, you kind of can't, you don't know what's happening next. It's inherently stressful, because your body can't predict. Well, where am I meant to go? What am I meant to do? How am I meant to think? How am I meant to feel? Because suddenly what I thought was happening next week may not be happening anymore. And that is why we're stressed and anxious. And then it just sort of it's so easy then to spiral, of course. So that's kind of what we've been grappling with. And we need, and back in kind of 2017, 2018, if you were not coping with uncertainty, perhaps you had a medical diagnosis you were waiting on, maybe you'd had a scan and you're waiting for a diagnosis and you didn't know what it was. Well, you'd probably go to Google and you'd be trying to fill that information gap with information, you'd be, and that would be your brain wanting information to fill a gap, to kind of get some certainty in there. Or, you've met someone in a bar, back in the olden days, and you were like waiting for them to ring, and you thought they were quite fancy, and you were kind of waiting for and so you'd be like, oh, maybe I'll look them up on LinkedIn, but how can I do that anonymously, and so you'd be trying to find information, because essentially we want to know. We don't like that state of uncertainty, the unknowingness, because that puts us into a real state of anxiousness. And now suddenly we are so familiar with that now as humans, like the whole globe now knows what that kind of uncertainty is all about. And I think we're still learning. We're still, learning those lessons on how to cope with that and what to do. And that's why I think the media, this constant stream from media that we're all consuming, doesn't always help, because it's more often doomsday than not.
It feeds it more, don't you think?
Yeah, I think you can. And so I just try and cut a lot of that input out that day. I try not to seek certainty from the media stream. The certainty I seek has to be back in the 90s. At the news stream, so it didn't matter. You just focused on kind of what was in front of you, like what literally have I got here and now in front of me in my physical hands. Can I read a book? Can I go for a walk? Can I hug the dog? Can I help my child with their homework? Can I just watch a TV program, like go and watch Mayor of Easttown or something? bringing all the goalposts in and making everything short-term and manageable, and in some schedule where you can control what's going on, because you can literally control what's in front of you, both in time and space, and cut off as much as you can that stream of uncertainty and horror coming in.
But it's the thing that's really hard is, okay, you can control, Sky News, and you can control the mainstream media. What's really hard, I think, definitely I noticed that in the last year, was the peer contacts that, people around you who are consuming that, and then they're forwarding it to you. And you might be completely rational and logical during the day, but when you go to sleep at night, and your defenses are lower, then those things filter through and create such havoc and uncertainty that I think from what I gather, that we're having a mental health crisis because people haven't coped very well with that uncertainty.
Oh, I don't, and we're not built to. Our brains are not engineered to cope with that. So that's why we have to be really be grown-ups about it. We have to be really, really careful to take care of ourselves, because we do actually have control over the information we take in. And sometimes that meant doing things that might not suit other people, but they really protecting my sanity and my sense of safety and my sleep, which is really important. And I need to be there to manage my kids through this.
I reached pretty much the same conclusion, because a couple of times you find that if you're not sleeping well, but then the next morning your child is still needing help with their homework, and they still need to be pushed to exercise and ensure that their physical health, and you need to be doing your chores. And so it got to a point where I was saying, literally, I can't spend my day just doom scrolling. No. When I have all this stuff, I mean, who's doing the chores in my house, and who's really making sure that the memories for my daughter are...
And we wouldn't let our kids doom scroll.
I
wouldn't want my mum doom scrolling, so I just, and it's hard not to. And that's that need for our brain to fill the uncertainty gap with some kind of information. But that's an unhealthy stream of information. So when it's so useful, we talked about life in the 90s. I just think default back to that when all that data wasn't there coming in, and life was so much simpler. And to try and engineer that back. In a way, which is hard when the main source of social interaction is sometimes via a computer. But again, I kind of keep saying to myself, I am a grown-up. I am an adult. I can advocate for my own self here. I need to just, work with these principles that I know help.
How do you think understanding neuroscience can help us, just in terms of what we're speaking about? How can we create more helpful collective ways of coping for the post-pandemic world?
Look, I mean, certainly for me personally, neuroscience is getting more helpful, I think. There's more sort of information we can take out of the lab and we can use in people's lives. Is certainly more than 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, when I sort of left the research lab and moved into science communications. There's so many... It's almost as if the science now is providing support for some of the basic old wisdom we've always had about sleep and nutrition and exercise. Now we kind of understand why they matter, and the little tweaks that we can make to help that matter. I think things for me that neuroscience has taught me is this idea around uncertainty, and I actually first started writing about that from a neuroscience perspective about 2 or 3 years ago. I was doing some work in the real estate industry, thinking about why it's so stressful buying and selling houses and moving houses. Like, why is that so stressful? Because again, it's around uncertainty, it's around safety, It's around, your house is your home, and you're either
Mm-hmm.
selling it or buying it or trying to find some new safe place to be.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't control a lot of that aspect of the process. There's a lot of uncertainty in there. So it really sort of shakes some of our basic needs,
Mm-hmm.
and having an understanding of not just what the brain needs, but why it needs it,
Yeah.
for me is really informative in terms of thinking, oh, well, it's not just some weakness I have. It's not just like me thinking my house is my home. Actually, that's a real kind of fundamental biological, psychological need
Yeah.
to function as a healthy, happy human.
Yeah.
And for me, neuroscience has given me that. So I've always been a good sleeper and I've always loved sleep, but I've got more passionate about the importance of sleep through
Yeah.
understanding more about neuroscience and why we sleep and what happens in our brains when we sleep, what happens when we don't sleep, why this whole stuff around scrolling through phones in the middle of the night is so damaging to our mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And then the really cool new neuroscience which has come in the last sort of few years around regulating sleep-wake cycles using sunrise and sunset. I mean, that's because our brains evolved on a planet where animals that evolved to see the sunrise and the sunset and the shifts of colours, and
Yeah.
that goes into our retina and goes into our brain and helps set all of our biological rhythms. So
Mm-hmm.
understanding these principles and seeing how that feeds into so many aspects of our physical health and our mental health and our brain health,
Mm-hmm.
for me is been so useful. It's, I suppose, there's neuroscience is so broad and deep and rich and lovely, and there's so much to learn and know, and I don't even know any of it. I know like this tiny little layer on the surface of the cortex. There is so much that I think's not just neuroscience, but psychology and behavioural science. Positive psychology can give to people these tools that we can start using and implementing. And a lot of it's supporting old knowledge that we know, so it's new and really cool.
Yeah. But I think for a lot of people now, it's those tools are helpful. But if the external world is constantly feeding that sense of uncertainty, don't you think there's only so much education and trying to manage your thoughts can get you?
Yeah, I'm not a fan. I always think that managing your thoughts is the hardest way to change. Using your thoughts to try and control your thoughts is like trying to catch a cloud in your hand. It's nearby impossible. For me, certainly, the practice of meditation, mindfulness meditation, and I'll get pushed back on this, for me is using my kind of thoughts to train my thoughts, and I just find it nearby impossible, and a real struggle and a real internal battle, whereas I would rather use, and I often talk about, I've talked before when we talk about tolerance to uncertainty. There's this constant stream of data coming into our brain from our body, our physiology, from we've got hormones and we've got heart rate, and we've got temperature, and we've got the food we eat, and the movements that we're making with our muscles are all this constant data stream going into our brain and back out into our body again, and this constant stream of data from the outside world, the people we're interacting with, our built environment, the chair I'm sitting on, and then our lived experience, our memories. Using our thoughts to change our thoughts is kind of like this little tiny nugget in the middle of that. We're almost then not using all of the other streams of data that come in which help determine a thought. And so the best way to change your thought is to move your body to a different place. Stand up and move and walk outside. We think that the only way we can change our thought is by thinking about it in a different way, or perhaps turning off Twitter. That's worse. I mean, you should turn off Twitter, but that's really hard.
Yeah.
Far easier to change a thought by changing a lot of the data coming into the brain.
So
That's why all of these little messages that we hear about going for a walk in the forest, or going and jumping in a cold pool of water, or the ocean, or exercising, or nourishing your body, but just this idea of standing up and moving out of the room you're in and moving into a different environment, particularly the natural world, and moving around in that is putting a lot of reliable natural data into your brain. One thing that I was always recommending everyone do, and I'm back to doing it now, I'm back in lockdown, is I've got a couple of kind of 5K loops. I walk around in the area I live, and I'm really lucky because I live by the ocean and I live in a lot of bushland, and I can do a lot of bush walks from my house with my dog. And I always follow the same track, and it's quite varied. There's a lot of really kind of steep, rocky bits and a few rivers to walk through, and there's some suburbs and shops, and I usually see some people I know, but it's a very natural environment, but it's familiar because I follow the same route. And so I'm not, and there's a lot of certainty in that. There's variety physically, but there's a lot of certain data coming in. And that's a far easier way to change my thoughts. As soon as I do that, I feel better. And I'll stop thinking about what I was thinking, because I'm not using my thoughts to try and change my thoughts. I'm using my body and moving my body into a different environment. All of the data inputs coming in are different.
That completely makes sense, because there were times when I would be, like stuck in the house, and, because of what I do, whether it's writing articles or just consuming so much media, because I analyze media to create a narrative that is more helpful, whatever it is. But then there were times when you feel so overwhelmed and your brain just feels like it's literally on fire because it's processing so much information.
And then the last thing you need to do is sit there and like try and practice some mindfulness. I think it didn't work. Like, even if you can't get out of your house, like go and jump in a cold shower, like shock your body in some way, like do some shocking physical thing to your body. That'll be 100 times easier than trying to use that brain of yours to think its way out of a thought.
And I'm a long-term
very clever people are very good at it, but I'm not.
No, I think there were times when meditation completely failed for me, and you say that, right? There are times meditation will fail.
I don't think it's the panacea, and I don't really like it. Like, I know people bang on about it all the time. It works for a lot of people, but I find it hard and boring and stressful. And I can take a few big deep breaths and do a bit of muscle relaxation, but the last thing I want to do when I'm feeling stressed or worked up is meditate or practice mindfulness or any of those practices, because they just wind me up even more, because they're hard, because a lot of it is around mind control. But then of course you say that, and then you get all these people getting in touch telling you don't really understand it properly, and you haven't understood the practice, and you need to learn more self-awareness and blah blah blah. And I'm like, you know what, I'd just rather go for a walk outside, because you can't kind of do that wrong, and no one then lectures you about how you didn't find the right practice or teacher. I just would rather go for a walk.
I've tried various forms of meditation, but don't you think walking too is a form of meditation? I mean,
I suppose if that's what you want to label it as. I just like calling it going for a walk with my dog. I think that there's a ton of benefit, and if you learn to do it and it's useful and it works for you and you understand it and it's something that you want to invest time and then go for it, that's amazing. And there's a lot of people get a lot out of it, but there's also people that don't. And that's not because they haven't figured it out or don't understand themselves properly or misunderstand the practice. That's just because you don't have to like everything. We're not all the same.
And we don't all have the same lifestyles, right? So we're not always in the same stage. Like there were times when on a Saturday, when I've got very little to do, meditation works super fast and really easy for me. I can stay in a meditative state. But like when I was working on my dissertation, I mean, by the end of it, I think I would have needed months of meditation just to get calm.
And I find that it's also quite solitary and self-reflective and inward-looking, and we get in trouble when we spend a lot of our time navel-gazing. I would rather shake things up by connecting with another person and just getting out of my body and out of my own mind and stop looking inward. And challenging myself that way and interacting with some other people and having a laugh, and just that kind of collective kind of, feel, when you're with other people, and that's been really hard in the last 18 months, but when you are with other people, even if you're just having, like, I try and talk to my mum as often as I can most days, and just having a good old chat to her just lifts me up and sorts everything out and puts me in a really great state. And, I've got a couple of friends I can do that with. And that's just as useful in terms of stress relief and self-awareness and emotional regulation and all of those other things that meditation can do, yet it's getting you out of yourself, and it's probably beneficial to the other person as well.
Yeah.
I'm sounding very anti-mindful meditation, but I do think that there are downsides to it which are not talked about enough, and the onus is then put back on the person who hasn't worked it out, which I don't think helps anyone, because there's other things that many of us find work as well.
Yeah. And you say that there's an upside of anger. There's an upside of anger. What is the upside of anger?
Yeah, I think that's really about this idea, and it partly comes out of positive psychology and comes out of some work by a positive psychologist called Robert Biswas-Diener, who's done some great work in this space. Who's we can get a bit caught up in kind of like positivity. We always need to be feeling good, positive, happy emotions, and we aren't used to sitting with uncomfortable feelings and uncomfortable emotions, and there can actually be an upside to learning to sit with discomfort. And sometimes the greatest days of our lives can be those in which we're the most physically uncomfortable or emotionally uncomfortable, and there can be sometimes great upsides to negative emotions. So some of the upsides to anger, it can force you into creativity, it can force you into social interaction. Anger doesn't need to foster violence or necessarily a negative social interaction, but it sometimes can be an incredibly powerful tool to change behavior or to change a way of thinking about something and forcing a behavior in another way. And so I think that's that title, The Upside of Anger, was really sort of looking into that world of that work around the focus on positivity all of the time, learning to sit with uncomfortable emotions and to see what they can teach us. And also, I was reading a bit recently around, that leads us to pathologize and medicalize every negative emotion, sadness and grief and loss, and all of the uncomfortable feelings we've all been feeling in the last few years aren't the signs of mental health issues, aren't all clinical depression and anxiety and psychosis. It's just shitty life stuff, and we can learn and grow from that, and we also have to kind of learn to sit with the discomfort and not medicalize it away.